Nightbreed was actually in the Guinness Book of Records for having the most monsters in any movie at the time. It's certainly the most monsters in any British movie, but I think it actually was in there for having the most monsters. So it's 300 monsters. It seems impossible now that anyone would put 300 monsters into one film, but they're all there. There are some long-term effects of the book, the Chronicles of the Nightbreed, that people who were just very young when Nightbreed came out, or even didn't see Nightbreed, but saw the book, that got them wanting to be into makeup and makeup effects, and that got them into prosthetics. So a lot of times I've had people come up to me and go, oh, the things you did for Nightbreed, I've not seen the film, but the things you did for Nightbreed were so fantastic. And that's really nice and reassuring that we actually did that, all of that process, all of those trying to be different, not trying to be yet another portfolio piece that would just could be genetically stamped out of any shop, and constantly trying to actually be different and weird, really showed off and really played, and still has harmony today in other ways. I don't think actors have a fair idea of what wearing prosthetics really does, right? A good prosthetics means that everything the actor does will come through and express on the outside. But you eventually, they'll look up and look in the mirror, and the face they've always seen for their entire life won't be looking back at them. The monster will be looking back at them. And that has some interesting effects. It has some positive effects. There's some pretty, people get scared and freaked by effects as well. But the process nearly always starts off with a life cast, which in itself is a pretty horrendous process. We use a material called alginate, which is meant for casting your teeth for dental work. And it's kind of like, it starts off like a cold mousse. You keep it cold, and you put it over the eyes, and you work your way down from the top, comes over the eyes, and then you cover up the nose, and they're still breathing through the mouth. You have them blow out through their nose, and you clear the nose. Sometimes you put straws in there, but we didn't used to like putting straws because it used to distort them. We would just look at, and then you have them close the mouth, and then you go all the way around the entire face, covering their own face. So all they really have is 2 breathing holes. And as the alginate starts to set up, you have little bits of tape that you put into the alginate as it sets. It takes about 3 minutes to set. Then you can put plaster bandage on. And the plaster bandage you then fold into these little pieces of cloth, so that the plaster bandage and the alginate will now stick together. They're usually wearing a bald cap because people don't like having stuff in their hair and it sticks. A good life cast will take something like 20 minutes. And you have to think that you're under that for a good amount of that time. So that process then gives you a negative of their face. And from that negative, you can pour plaster in. We use a very hard plaster called Cristacal or Ultracal. And the advantage of that is when it goes off, it's like really, really solid. You take off the outer cast, and that original mould is then thrown away. And what you're left now with is a plaster cast. That plaster cast nearly always needs cleaning up. You need to clean up the line where the bald cap goes. You need to clean up cracks or something like that. So you have to work fairly quickly with that, because once this thing is set, within a couple of hours, this is going to be like rock solid. You also don't want to make that cast solid all the way through with plaster, because it'll overheat in the oven if you're using that. Sometimes you then take a mould off of that and take fiberglass out of that mould, so that you end up with a fiberglass of the actor's face. And at that point, and only at that point, can you then start to sculpt on top. And the sculpting of prosthetics is a very difficult art, because you're adding something to someone's face, but you don't want it to make the face look bigger. So you're constantly adjusting the thickness of the prosthetic as it's sculpted, so that you're both working in believability, but also altering the shape enough to get the character you want through. You also have a lot of technical issues at that time, where you have to think about blending edges and edges that will touch down and disappear eventually when they're made in whatever material you're making them out of. Then we used to use sometimes a plaster mould, most times a fiberglass mould off of that. And these moulds will have to be very cleverly designed so that when, at the time it was foam rubber was put in, there'd be a very, very, very thin cutting edge that would cut the foam off a point. So you'd have a little, very, very, very thin blending edge where you'd be blending back to the skin. Nowadays you'd probably use silicone, but the process is still pretty much the same. Then those moulds would be cooked and baked out and washed, and all the chemicals reduced from them. And then a multi-part foam liquid, so foam rubber. So you'd whip up foam and you'd put a curing agent in it and a gelling agent and other agents in it, so that this material would whip itself up and then it would gel. So you had a limited amount of time, and if it was too hot in the day, your rubber would all go off in the basin of the mixer, and you'd have the nightmare of pulling it all off of the whisk. So we had probably the first air conditioning in the UK. We don't need a lot of air conditioning in the UK, but when it gets warm, you can't run foam. So we had air conditioning. We had little mobile air conditioning units, and then this is pumped in, or it's painted into the mould, and then that process is then baked in an oven, and the foam then solidifies and stays. If you touch it when it's raw, it collapses in on itself. But once it's cooked, it becomes like a sponge. So it's now got the process of you approach it, it's got a memory, it comes back. That piece is very carefully removed off. It's then washed, because there are a lot of chemicals in the foam that you don't want on people's skin, and dried. And you have to be careful how you dry them. You can't just throw them in a tumble dry. You have to put them into a pillowcase, or the preferred process, we have this old mangle, which is this two great big wooden rollers that were used in the turn of the century to squeeze out water, and you'd be feeding your prosthetics with paper towels through, and then having boxes and boxes full of wet paper towels to get rid of the water from washing them. And then you'd hang them out to dry, and then you'd repair them and fill in any places and make them all good, and then you would undercoat them with a base coat. You would seal them, and a lot of the times with Nightbreed for speed, we would pre-colour. So we would airbrush the basic colours on, so that when they were applied, just the blending edges had to be worked in. If you were lucky, that was the process. Sometimes you just had raw pieces and you had to do the whole thing from start to finish on the face. And then you'd have to stick it down to the actor. So this is where it gets tricky, because you've now got a human factor. That same person who all that time ago had that mould now has these thin pieces of latex stuck down to them, and we stick it down with a glue called Prosthetics, which has the ability to stick really strong. But you only really get a little time before it goes and it's down. So you have to be very careful where you put it down to make sure you don't ruin all the illusion. You work your way around, you blend the edges off, you seal the edges, you seal the piece when it's on the actor's face, and finally you colour and tone and match. And then there might be hair pieces or other things that go on top, and there might be contact lenses which go in the final end. The actor goes through hours. The average makeup on Nightbreed, I think, was about 3, maybe 4 hours. Some of the makeups took 9 hours to do. So you get them to a point where they become very tired, and they become, sometimes their heads are dropping and sleeping because you've come in so early to get them ready for the call. And then suddenly they're done. And the third AD's coming in and saying, you know, we're ready to go on set now, and you've just about made it. You've just made it through that point. And now you've got a day's shooting. Now you've got 12 hours. So you then gather up your makeup tools, you gather up your on-set kit, you take them down onto set. If you're on Nightbreed, you might leave them there and then go back to the workshop and do a full day's work in the workshop. And that goes on through the day. They need touching up, they need this horrendous dust removed from them all the time. you've got then the process of then is you have to, at the end of the day, everybody goes, okay, it's a wrap, and everybody else goes home, and you and that poor actor start the process of taking it all off. If you rip off a makeup off, you'll damage the skin. You'll actually literally physically take the top layer of skin and create wilts in it. So you very carefully have to use an oil that expands the foam. Slightly different when you're doing silicone pieces. But then you have to destroy that piece. So you end up with this piece that's big and puffy and useless, which you throw in the bin, and that was that one day's character. And that's the process. And then the next day you might do the same thing again. Start all over again.